You're listening to Catching Wildfire, a podcast by the Public Safety Broadband Technology Association. Welcome to another edition of Catching Wildfire, a podcast focused on wildfire issues across the United States. And wow, we've got a couple great guests today. My name is Jeff Johnson. I'm your host, along with my co-host, Chief Kim Zagaris, known as Chief Z. And we have the pleasure today to be meeting with and talking with David Torgerson, who is the founder, CEO, and president of Wildfire Defense Systems in Bozeman, Montana. And we'll have an introduction going on. First, Kim, would you introduce yourself? Tell us a little about your background.
Okay. Kim Sagaris, been in the business about 48 years, 38 of those with the state of California, the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, 18 years as their fire chief. I also worked prior to that in Shasta County as a CETA employee back in the days. If people remember those federally funded positions, and then went on to work for the Bureau of Land Management in both Las Vegas and Carson City, and eventually Nevada BLM state office, where I came to California. And I retired from Cal OES and really officially in February of 2019. And I've been working for Western Fire Chiefs ever since, and still actually have kind of a foot in, a foot out of Cal OES as what we call retired annuitant. They bring me in when they need some issues or background or operational experience. So,
Chief Z, great to have you. The chairman of the FCC spent a day with Chief Zagaris on a mega fire and deemed Chief Zagaris the national treasure. I don't think anything better describes it. I'm very fortunate to have with us David Torgerson from Wildfire Defense Systems. David, would you introduce yourself and your company?
Yeah, sure. I'm a civil engineer, civil environmental engineer, 35 years now. In working across major large projects across the West in not only engineering, but now over the last 18 years in wildfire. Wildfire Defense Systems is a company that works for the insurance industry and provides firefighter response to increase the survivability of insured properties using what we call pre-suppression tactics, preparing the properties in real time, following the mitigation that has been through the research of Firewise and IBHS and others over time. I'm here in our coordination center today in Bozeman, Montana. We work across North America. Our coordination center, when at peak season, has about 35 people working in it as we track fires across multiple states and multiple countries.
Well, it's been a pleasure to get to know you and your company over the years, David. You guys do some incredible work, and you're kind of like the people a lot of us didn't know about. And you make tremendous difference with your mitigation work on fire scenes. But I think one of the things that I'm just most fascinated about is kind of your effect on the insurance industry. So maybe we start there. Like it's the beginning of the carrot and stick effect with the insurance industry. And what is changing in the insurance industry? How do you see it, and where do you think it's going?
You know, we work in a lot of places, so we're not just firefighters on the ground working on the incidents, but we work all the way up through the chain of engineering and up into insurance products and up into the reinsurance industry and the financial markets. And so we have a very broad view of what's going on. Now, we're most known for our white and blue trucks that show up on incidents, and we're commonly on 150 to 250 wildfire incidents a year. We typically will be responding to, if not all, nearly all wildfires that threaten structures at any significant level, as we work across dozens of insurance companies to help them and their policyholders have better outcomes in properties surviving wildfire incidents. But it gives us a view deeper into what's going on across wildfire, across insurance, and across financial markets. And that view is fairly unique because we work across multiple states and we work across multiple industries. And so we often get early indications of where things might be going as we can kind of see parts and pieces from different industries that might be developing in those directions. So that was a really broad question. Where do we see all of this going all the time? I guess the easiest way to say that is that, like other experts in the industry, we had expectations that conflagration and that we were close to having a situation like the LA Basin fires last fall, year ago, last January. And so we start thinking about those situations before they happen, and we start thinking about how we can help the insurance industry and the financial markets before those things happen. And it sends us down a road that is uniquely different because nobody else really has a mission to go down that road.
It seems like people are pretty frustrated with insurance companies canceling their individual policies in the West, and us firefighter types are not exempt from that. Like, so is the blame really on the insurance company, or does the reinsurance market have a big issue with this? And what's at the root cause of that?
Well, there's a lot of answers to that questions, and I think I'll start at the modeling. As things happen, how you model the future to predict what's going to happen changes what that modeling looks like. And so while we're accustomed to going backwards in time, 10, 20 years in the insurance industry, about what they think is going to happen in the future, and the data gets loaded from what's happened in the past. And the challenge that we're having right now is that information from the past isn't keeping up with what's happening in the future. So we have this really difficult situation, which is kind of a lot like how hurricanes changed quickly over time in Florida and what that did to the Florida insurance markets. It's very difficult to model a future that we haven't fully experienced in the past. And so a lot of that modeling is called return periods. You can graph exposure versus return intervals, and it's kind of like a flood plane. You know, I'm a civil engineer, so you look at a 1 in 100 flood or a 1 in 500 flood. Well, the challenge with wildfire right now is that we're kind of looking at those 1 in 100 year or 1 in 200 year situations, but they keep happening over and over. And in the last 5 years, we've had, incidents that are really only supposed to happen every 50 or 100 years. So that's a real challenge for the industry in order to try to figure out how to navigate in that space as claims go up. And these LA Basin fires created record economic loss that has never been seen before. Estimates are ranging now between 25 and 40 billion, maybe even north of a little of 40 billion. So how can the insurance companies understand how to change their financial platforms fast enough to have their premiums cover these levels of losses? That means they have to view things in the models a little differently. It means that we have things like moving from admitted insurance, which is what most of us all have on our homes, to excess and surplus lines insurance, which is a little different product for a higher risk situation. So all the industry is having to re-navigate itself to understand if they can have premiums that sustain them in the admitted, the normal homeowners market, or if they need to shift some of their book to the excess and surplus lines. For a homeowner, that's a big shift. That's kind of that shock that you see in that situation. While that's going on, we have smaller insurance companies starting and saying, well, you know what? We're small. We're going to come into this space. We're interested in picking up some of these policies that larger carriers are finding difficult to model. And so the market's going through this shift right now, very similar to how it has done in California, in Florida.
I always kind of think about it, but what kind of happens in California kind of makes its way eastward, is the way I kind of always look at it. And our wildland problem's been here for a while, but it's surely not getting any better. And then we've experienced, the insurance industry really, it's been accelerated to me since really the 2017 North Bay fires, followed by the Camp Fire. And we just keep, piling these mega fires on, and with the destruction of homes that we have. But it's forced a lot of the insurance industry out. California, brought in their way of backstopping insurance, and of course, the FAIR plan in California, even before the January fires, had already oversold the amount of coverage their portfolio has to pay off the claims that are out there now. And it's kind of interesting watching where, not only the insurance watches it, but actually how the insurance companies themselves and the underwriters are really viewing us and what's happening in the West as a whole.
Yeah, the FAIR plan is a really good example. And Florida had a similar plan called Citizens that needed to step in as the same kind of um, delta between what they were experiencing versus what they could hold together as a sustainable structure. So it's about sustainability at this point, and the FAIR plan has come and of course grown quite a bit. The challenge is that as we get this change in fire conditions and we really ramp up mitigation as best we can. So I think as a society, either at the university level or the federal, the state level, and all the FireWise programs, everybody's invested in mitigation as fast as they can to reduce the propensity for wildfires to cause damage. And we're getting some traction in there. I sit on the International Code Council. We write the 605 standards on wildfire, and those are intended to come in at some point to the WUI code. So these are the model codes. And so as landowners or land managers, or meaning the governments and the states and things like that, can mitigate where the forest is and where the fuels are. And we work to change codes over time so that the structures become more adaptable. But the challenge is that in the same way that the insurance industry has to look backwards in time to get data on their modeling and try to find a situation, as we work very hard on mitigation, mitigation is the answer to our problem. And when I say mitigation, I don't mean just raking the forest or cleaning your gutters. I mean that the building codes are mitigation too, so that the structures can survive the situation. But short-term fuel mitigation helps, but we can see that the conditions are getting so bad so fast that it's not helping fast enough to stop urban conflagrations from occurring. And when we get a wildfire-induced ignition into an urban conflagration setting, that setting of that built environment hasn't been able to be adapted by the codes or the science and the research. We're working to create wildfire prepared communities, and that's helpful, but it kind of leaves a gap in the process. So we're vulnerable in the short term here. We know we have a pathway built that will be sustainable for the insurance companies, but it really means adapting the built environment, and that happens over decades. So our real challenge here is that all parties, that work in wildfire, local, state, federal, even in the insurer programs that we operate at large scale, are really helping in that mitigation space. But that conflagration space is what's creating situations like Eaton and Palisades that's driving us into the tens of billions of dollars of loss. And as a society, we haven't had to address that quite in the same way. Now, historically, we can go back to the Great Fire in London in the 1600s, and we can go back to Chicago in the 1800s, and we can go back to San Francisco, 1906, I believe. But those were about the urban core. So we have this vulnerability zone that has really been built out between the wildland interface and the urban core. And that zone, from a civil engineering standpoint, was not built to survive or stop a conflagration situation, which is radiation driven. So these are all the pieces of the puzzle that is making reinsurance sustainability difficult, and it all drives down to rate changes, like you said.
I'm glad you're bringing some science to it, David. Like the one thing, just from basic civilian, right? The one thing I think they got wrong was the insurance companies were wrong about what their risk was. I think that's undeniable. That to your point, the environment changed so much faster than their modeling, and for lots of good reasons, but they were wrong. And that's thrown everything from the reinsurance to the insurance market into a bit of a spin cycle, and it ends up in things that don't make sense, like clunky policies. Like your insurance company says, well, I'm not writing in this zip code. Well, they don't know if my house is concrete and steel or if it's made out of cedar shakes. You don't know. It seems like it's got to be a lot smarter in terms of the mitigation. And I think when I first met you, that was kind of the space that you were in, and I know you still are. But can you tell us about what your company does in real time to mitigate risk for an insurance company?
Yeah, sure. So, our common day-to-day operations, like we have today, we're tracking fires across North America, and we work to dispatch into those locations. And when we dispatch, we work with properties as many as 2,500 properties a week. We can navigate to perform mitigation actions that are already proven to show that that they work in that environment, because of the research in mitigation. But the homeowner hasn't been able to necessarily understand it or take those tasks until when that's not done before a fire gets there. So typically about 30 minutes we can come through and we can make a property highly survivable. We do that in the ember zones. We can do that inside the fire perimeters itself. And we don't need to be near the fire to do that. We can work close or about where we think the fire is going to go. And once we work through a property, then it kind of takes that property off the fire map. It just reduces the vulnerability, or the volatility is what the insurers call. So they end up having less properties that are at high risk. So we know that the fire service is working on suppression, stopping the fire, working with suppressions around the structures and things like that. But what we do is we're going to be focused on creating a property so that when the fire service pulls up to it, they don't have a lot of tasks, or maybe even any tasks that they need to do. The gutters are clean, the fuels are swept away, the propane bottles are turned off and moved away. It's really mitigation labor work. It happens in real time right during the incidents, but it really takes the workload down. If we can take 1,000 properties in a wildfire incident or in a given week, our peak level of operation was in the Caldor and Dixie combined at the same time. We did about 4,500 properties on those fires. And then the structure protection unit, it can travel around, and instead of having to do mitigation, it can really focus on something like suppression. An ember starts something, but it's not having to face nearly the workload, ideally, because those structures were wildfire prepared, if not by plan or by design before, they became wildfire prepared during the incident.
I think what really hit me is you guys aren't firefighters, and you're ahead of that. You're ahead of, essentially the exclusion, the hot zone, as it were, making sure that you're reducing my risk as an incident commander for me and mine, and protecting the home at the same time. Yeah, I think sometimes that's lost on incident commanders. Like you're a battalion chief or division chief. You pull up, you got X going on. I think there's lots of education we need to do to just let them know who you are and what you're doing, because they have a choice, and that choice is really helpful. You come into my neighborhood, you're reducing risk for me and my neighbors, and taking a load off the fire department without fighting fire.
Yeah, so we are IAFF. So all of our employed firefighters are in the union, and we have the exact same certifications and training to be in the wildland interface under NIMS and under ICS. And so while we're fully certified and equipped, all of our resources pass Viper, federal contract inspections and things like that. But the point is that if, like, we are in the hot zone and having to do suppression, we kind of miss the mark. I mean, we can only do suppression on one house when we could have done pre-mitigation on 10. So our job is to get as many mitigated as possible. So it's not our design to be running into the hot zone. And what we want to be able to do is get as many properties as survivable as possible. And then really the fire service can continue to focus on their job. We want the end result to be as good as possible. And if that's the fire service can save a certain number of houses, and then we can make it easier for them to ultimately have saves on a whole bunch of other houses, then society, homeowners, and insurance companies and policyholders just get a better outcome. That better outcome is really important, because when we talked about the delta, that gap between how fast we can mitigate and everything survives on itself versus how bad the fires are getting, we need to do something to create more sustainability. And mitigation is long-term sustainability. Those projects, those fuels, rebuilding buildings and things like that. So we need something in there. We need a tool in there that gives us some cover between how bad the fires are getting and how much survivability mitigation can happen, because the insurance industry is the one that, and the policyholders are the ones that are living in the gap. And so while large spends can happen to maintain the fire service, and large spends can happen to maintain large scale mitigation projects, we still have a gap happening in there when we look at the economic loss statistics over the last 5 or 10 years. So this program, or these kinds of programs, we call them qualified insurance resources, because first of all, they're union and they meet all of the requirements, local, state, and federal, and they're fully insured and backed for all these operations. And we particularly have a history of 1,600 wildfires now, more than 1,600 that we've been on over the last 18 years in this space. So that help goes a long way. And when we are struggling with near-term sustainability, one of the largest things that's happened in this country to narrow that gap of sustainability and try to make it more sustainable for carriers to maintain policies and rates is literally this large scale response program that the carriers have put in place via our operations. And we do the vast majority of this work in the country.
Kind of interesting. I've had a pleasure, David, when we first met going back to 2008, and to where you've evolved to this point. And I mean, JJ here, as he just was chatting about how you get involved, what your crews and those resources are actually doing out there. Can you chat maybe just a little bit how your agency reps kind of interact with the incidences, from the time they're headed out the door to arriving on scene? And, I know you guys have, not only that you've got that aspect, but you've really put a doctrine in place for your employees and overall for how they're going to operate there through your doctrine.
Sure. I mean, the doctrine is just exactly the same. It's NIMS, it's NWCG, it's ICS, it's CCI, it's CCIIS in California. Help me there, Kim. CC. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so it's exactly the same. Now, our organization started in 2001 as a federal contractor, as all organizations do. But at our core, we're an engineering firm. So engineering firms have to manage the compliance, the permitting, and the regulation for the customer or the owner. Now, that might be for a road project or an airport, but we've always taken the same thing. So our engineering group manages compliance. Our field operations is all traditional fire service. And so we respond to the incidents the same way that an incident would receive any other contractor that they call to the incident under a federal or state resource order. So that system's been the same all the way along. So we're going to come in, we're going to check in with a liaison officer. We've got operating protocols that we have provided on every incident. We've worked with the laws, together, Chief Z and I and others, and not Fire Scope, but in California, Fire Scope Council in California. And we've even driven those protocols into laws in states now, not only in California, but in other states. So the system is well baked, and there's things to pull from that are either at state level or under NWCG or Western Fire Chiefs or state operating agencies. And so it's become fairly standard for us. Now, we're a qualified insurance resource. We still have to navigate a world where either landowners or others might bring in unqualified personnel. And that's just something that has to be navigated under the protocols and the laws, no different than how an incident normally manages all its resources. And so it's become pretty standard operating procedure for us. Our access rates, getting access on incidents, are essentially 100%. Sometimes there's a little bit of time of coordination time necessary, that if the incident commander or the liaison is not quite as familiar, but essentially almost all of the wildfire incident command teams are well aware of us. It's really just some municipalities and volunteer departments that may not have already had us on fires. But there's always room to make that tighter and better. And we continue to work in that space and coordinate with the associations and with the laws in the states.
Yeah, I kind of think that, it'd be good if we could, still get to a point of a centrally coordinated point on the, with the incidences that you're arriving and those things. And I always kind of laugh because, the communication, coordination, and collaboration is, to me, the key points of what we have to do out there. And as I was listening to one of the talks there at the iChiefs WUI conference this week, they shared with us that just the Dingle Act, they're finally 7 years down the road, now actually able to start sharing the AVL on vehicles that they, take them 7 years to get to that point. So maybe we could cut that time down for a better notification system across the country when resources like yours are arriving or en route to help the incident. Let's cross our fingers.
Yeah, now we do that already with all of our resources, and we've been doing those pushes both at the state and federal level in the state of California for many years. So with the expectation of the Dingle Act, we had moved into those spaces. So we are already shown on many of the major tracking systems that federal and state resources are managing incidents off. So we're already into those spaces and doing that. And in fact, right here on this screen, we can zoom in on any of the fires that we're tracking, any of the locations of our vehicles, and we can track the location of the vehicle down to just updates just every few minutes. We know where they are on the incident, any particular street, any group of properties. And so the level of detail that we've had to operate has been basically the Dingle Act level, and we've been doing that for many, many years.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting watching a number of agencies that have gone on to tablet command, and then we also work with some folks that are just now getting into this space out there as well. So that it's kind of interesting to watch how we're able to more integrate this information. And I think as we do a better job of sharing the IP addresses for those AVL and integrating those, and your resources moving with everybody else, is going to be really exciting to watch.
Yeah, and a large response to us is maybe putting 50 resources on a fire. We operate as much as 200 wildfire resources, fully equipped, fully staffed, fully inspected, fully certified. So yeah, that kind of coordination will be important because as the fires are big and we have more and more resources working in bands away from the fire, doing work in the mitigation in the wildfire space, it's getting to be such a big job that there's a lot of personnel and a lot of resources engaged in doing it. We want to be as efficient as possible. And we've been very fortunate and we've worked very hard to have a very high safety record, very high success of safety in doing this. And so across 1,600 wildfires, we've been working and perfecting this craft. And we can deliver any of the notices, any of the placements, any of the notifications, any real systems that the government or the fire service ultimately puts in place. And I think it'll all kind of come together maybe in a more formal setting as the Dingle Act progresses into operations.
What are your conclusions about fire size, magnitude, and intensity, and what the outcomes are? You have to be seeing trends as an engineering firm.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a data analytics department. We model. We have mathematicians on staff, engineers, scientists, and that real synergism with incident commanders that we have on staff. And so we get that view. And oddly enough, we have a vocabulary problem. And so when I start looking this as it's a system problem across this, it keeps trying to get solved by mitigation and firefighting, but it's more complicated than that. It's society, it's laws, it's all those things. And when one group tries to pull a handle, you pull that lever and it might not make sense in relationship to, either a political side or an insurance side or a financial side with that problem. And so it's a systems problem. And so we need new vocabulary, and we've been working to introduce that vocabulary. For example, we don't see that the insurance industry, we don't see that the reinsurance industry, which is insurance companies for insurance companies, we don't see that they really have a wildfire problem. Wildfire, if you define it as fire in the wildland space or in the wildland urban interface, it doesn't really get to a scale of creating a lot of economic loss. And economic loss is what reinsurance companies backstop in the system. The reinsurance companies don't have a wildfire problem because there's just not enough economic loss in the WUI to do that. They have a conflagration problem. They have a problem when fires turn into urban conflagrations, and the drivers of fire, convection, conduction, and embers, gets replaced with radiation. And when it gets with radiation, then we get structure to structure ignition. And as you well understand, we don't have a wildfire problem. We have a runaway structure fire problem. And in that environment, the reinsurers are going to have a harder time because, Chief Z, when you get conflagration going and you've got multiple structures burning in the same block, you're in a structure environment with wildfire resources. How do you keep your workforce in there doing what it does when you've got too many structures burning around it and you need structure fires and SCBAs? Am I analyzing that correctly?
You're right on. In fact, I can tell you this, that the health and wellness issue for wildland is, and what we do for respiratory protection is really being pushed very hard. And, you're on target.
If our firefighters can't be in that environment, or our mitigation, our pre-suppression personnel, and they wouldn't be anyway because they'd be moving away, but if the tactics are all mitigation, and mitigation is delivered by people or pumps or rakes or anything coming off a truck, and the truck has to mobilize out of there, the problem for the reinsurers is that radiation takes over, and radiation defines what's going to happen at that point. Until it can get into the urban core, until we can get that 10-meter distance or that 30 to 40-foot distance between structures and the urban core with commercial properties and parking lots, that radiation is going to keep going until something happens and the fire service can return to that environment. So that's why we very much think that reinsurance has a conflagration problem that can't be solved by mitigation or suppression by definition, just by physics and by physics and health and safety requirements. So that's the realm of engineering, and we are engineers, and our insurance and our financial products can't wait that long. So that's why we are delving into that space of conflagration as an engineering problem. And we've been working on it for about 5 years, and we've got solutions that we'll be delivering out into society and into the insurance and the financial markets.
It's extremely important. One of the things I shared with a reporter yesterday when I chatted, and we talked a little bit about, and I said, I look at the WUI conference, going to be going on about 20 years plus now. And when we first started, real heavily about operations, and now when you sit in there, there's a real heavy load on firewise and mitigation and those things out there. But it's one of the interesting things I always find, and JJ, your time there at Tualatin Valley and that, so we grant all this money out to agencies to reduce and for home hardening in some cases. What I find amazing is that why we don't tie future disaster funds and mitigation funds, to actually forcing state and local agencies to put those ordinances in place now for not only for future building, but how we can actually home harden and do some things in the clearance that probably needs to be done. And then somebody said, well, yeah, I don't know. And I said, well, the bottom line is that the politicians won't like it because the developers, the landowners, the contractors, they'll all be up in arms. And, of course, that will all get passed on to the homeowner. But we don't build and do some things. And I think engineering is an important key to this. But on the same end, I think that the insurance industry and even the fire service, if we really want to get serious about preventing wildfires or doing a better job putting our people in harm's way, we're really going to have to dig in and again, build to the future, harden where we need to, and then find a better way to reduce the fuels and have an ongoing process to reduce those fuels. And I think the insurance companies should be on board. And even some fire chiefs may not like it, but at the end of the day, they should all be in unison, tied together, pushing our politicians down that road where we need to get to.
Yeah, David, I'm so glad that you guys are, and you are so careful to talk about being in the engineering space, because that is so critical. And this is a personal opinion, but for me, I think the people that got a pass in the current state of wildfire vulnerability for residential, I think the urban planners have gotten a pass in that. That during my entire period as fire chief, the emphasis from urban planners to narrow the streets, to reduce water main size, to reduce setbacks on houses to the point you can hardly squeeze between them, to drop construction materials away from something that tends to resist fire to something that actually is a little helpful to fire. Like that stuff contributes to the fact we get these urban conflagrations, and that just beats this unbeatable heat flux of radiant heat that you just cannot beat. And you take a look at silly things like the American Water Works Association and their policies. Again, when I was fire chief in one particular water district, and we had 16 of them, one of them, the system development charge was more than the typical cost of installing a 13D residential fire sprinkler system in the house. So if you think about that, they wanted a surcharge because you were installing a sprinkler, and it was the very sprinkler that was going to avoid your house burning down. And we've done a pretty good job in compartmentalizing the house for the interior space. We've done a good job with 13D. We just have to take care of some of those policies and some of the lack of alignment, which frankly has been absent the scientific analysis. So, David, any final thoughts on kind of how your company and how engineering and science are going to play into the broader vision as we move forward?
It's about systems now, and the way that building codes and construction happen, JJ, as you explained that. So we need a different system, because the system was planners and materials get built a certain way. There is an expectation by those who own the homes or the politicians or the communities that between the fire service and the insurance industry, that form of construction and urban planning or suburban planning can navigate in the environment. And our fire conditions have changed so that that system doesn't really work that way anymore. It's built that way, and it worked fine in the kinds of conditions that we've had in prior decades, but that's where that breakdown has happened, that sustainability. So it's literally in that space. So that got built with engineering. That environment was built with engineering and those standard practices, and so we don't have that. So for instance, if we're going to build with those kinds of separation distances on structures and those lot lines, then one house goes on the front of the lot, one goes on the back of the lot. That takes down 2/3 of the radiation potential that we have, and we're dealing with radiation on corners instead of flat surfaces. Those are easy changes. Or the engineering would be that for every 5 houses, you have to have some form of a radiation break so that you don't lose more than 5 house structures at a time before radiation can be broken. Once radiation is broken, the fire service can work in that protection shadow in a place where it is, because as soon as you break that radiation with a barrier of some kind there, then you're back to a wildfire situation. So we want to create pockets of wildfire situations all through the subdivisions so that the responding first responders and fire service can move from operating pocket to operating pocket, and they know where the radiation is going to get broken. That's all systems at this point, systems and engineering. And even the 605 standards that have come out are more mitigation based at this point. We don't really have a body of engineering. I will say that the insurance industry is really leading that way. The Institute for Business and Home Safety, the research labs that can test and burn down and measure structures in that space are identifying the radiation. We're getting on top of the science pretty quick, but my industry of engineering is going to have to step in, because it's not fair for the for the scientists to work it out and the insurance industries somehow have to be the fix. They have to be the fix in order to get their rates and their sustainabilities right. That's the realm of engineering in there. And that's why we say that wildfire mitigation and suppression, check. Got that well understood. Conflagration and engineering, which is really driving the economic losses, not so checked yet at this point. And we don't want to just keep viscerally reacting to fire like fire is bad, water is good, mitigation is going to solve all of it. We have to, that's only 3 steps in a 5-step process. So we're really going to have to lean into that next step, and that's a focus that we're very committed to.
Well, David, on behalf of the National Treasurer, Chief Zagaris, and myself, I just want to thank you for the work you're doing in this country. Also want to thank FirstNet, who is our sponsor, and the Western Fire Chiefs, who bring us experts like David Torgerson from Wildfire Defense Systems. And David, we wish you continued success in trying to rethink the engineering and the systems that go in to creating an environment we can defend communities in, and bring us a little smarter tools and technologies so that the next decade, we're seeing this problem get smaller, not bigger. So on behalf of the Western Fire Chiefs, David and Kim, thank you both for joining.